Hi everyone, my name is George Arnold and I'm Head of Commercial here at Invest Africa. Thanks very much for listening to our new Meet the Minister series of webinars, where we speak to ministers responsible for various portfolios across the continent to get the latest updates on the policies they are implementing within their specific sectors. It will allow investors and businesses like you the opportunity to hear how your businesses can better operate in the country. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the Honourable State Minister of Finance, Dr. Eyob Tekalign. State Minister, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, I think I can fairly say you have one of the most exciting portfolios in Ethiopia. You're responsible for leading and supporting the reform agenda currently underway in the country. Last time we spoke was with a group of investors in Addis under much different circumstances. So let's jump right into it, as I don't think there is anywhere else that we can start other than coronavirus. Perhaps you can give us a little update on how the government is tackling the spread of coronavirus, especially in light of the first few deaths which were sadly reported over the weekend?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for availing this opportunity. As you've said rightly, we have had, I think, a wonderful conversation when you guys are here in Addis few months back. I think none of us have imagined that the world would completely change as we know it. And because of this coronavirus, things have changed completely upside down. And as the entire world feels the pressure of this pandemic, Ethiopia is also gaining its fair share in terms of the economic impact. I'll come back to it, but generally, as you know, corona is not just only a health pandemic; it's also a significant setback on economic progress across the world. So it requires a concerted effort, a coordinated response. So in Ethiopia, we're looking at it as a health and an economic crisis, and as such, our response is multifaceted. On the health front, the focus is really on making sure the spread is as minimal as possible. As you probably have noticed, the government has introduced very strict social distancing measures. Schools have been closed. Government agencies are working from home, except critical folks who need to be in the office because of the nature of their job. But across the country, movement of people is by and large curtailed. Only essential, supply chain travels are intact. So our hope is, because of these early and decisive measures, the effect of the pandemic in terms of the spread would be as minimal as humanly possible. As you know, across the world, the epidemiological forecast is not reassuring. The extent at which this virus spreads is worrisome, to say the least. But to our knowledge, we are doing our level best to respond to that. But also, while hoping for the best, we are preparing for the worst. So in that case, in that sense, sort of strengthening the health system, putting in place proper quarantine system, availing additional facilities, mobilizing resources for emergency needs, medical and food emergencies, which for the next couple of months only amounts to minimum of 1.6 billion US dollars. So in terms of mobilizing resources, reprioritizing government budget, I think we're doing everything in that front. But also, since this is also an economic pandemic, we're looking at the short-term and long-term impacts of the pandemic on the economy. So in that sense, we are operating under 2-3 scenarios. The first scenario is what we call best case scenario, where we can really control the spread of the virus, and the economic impact will be largely in our relation to external trade, which has already kicked in. Our service export has plummeted. So Ethiopian Airlines takes the lion's share of our service export, and that has almost come down to zero, taking about 3/4 of the overall export, service export. You can imagine the impact of that. Tourism is on a standstill across the world, and the same thing here. hotels are operating with almost zero occupancy rates. And in terms of international trade, import and export, those sectors are highly affected. And then it's kicking into the real economy as well, as the stay-home social distancing measures are enforced. Small businesses are hardly hit. So our economic measure is something that looks at the immediate impact of this shock and devise a strategy on how we can overcome it in the short term, which means how do we make sure employees are at least paid through this difficult time so that they can pass through the hard time without worrying what to eat and how to feed their family. And the other is how do we keep the firms intact? If you look at the flour sector, for instance, the export of flour sector is almost zero. It has come down to 80-90% decline. But the people in this sector need to operate because the nature of that industry is even if you don't export, you still have to farm, cut, and at times destroy because that's how the industry works. And for that, we need to have a specific strategy. The government has availed about 15 billion per through private commercial banks so that they can sort of give breathing space for their customers in terms of debt rescheduling and also additional loans as needed. But looking at overall macro impact of this pandemic and seeing its effect over the long haul, the next 3 months, 6 months, in fact, as we look at the next year, the overall focus is to make sure this pandemic will not leave a permanent shock in the economy. In Ethiopia-like economy, where we've just come out of a macroeconomic imbalance and we're set for continuous and sustained growth, a significant permanent shock could have significant impact and can be a major setback. So our focus is on making sure to the extent possible that this will not leave a permanent shock in the economy. I mean, that's overall something I would like to say to start with, but we can come back to it if you require.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And if I can I pick up on a couple of points you said there in particular? One, you'd mentioned the support that you were providing to businesses, in particular providing to flour exporters. Can you touch on that a little bit more and give us a little bit of an indication to how else the government, what other sort of measures and support the government is providing to other businesses in other sectors? Do you have sort of like a strategy for specific sectors get X support, or how is that sort of structured?
Sure. I think the first set of economic measures focus on the sectors that were really hit under the baseline scenario. I mean, the effects were different. Sectors that are exporting, importing to the hospitality industry and from the export side, largely vulnerable sectors like flour and so on. So we have disaggregated our approach. I mean, if you look at some of the export sectors, say coffee, for instance, is largely unaffected, affected but not significantly. But sectors like flour have been hardly hit. So our measure has to be commensurate with impact of the pandemic on that specific sector. So we have an overall strategy, to stabilize, to ensure macro financial stability, to sort of manage the macroeconomic impact of this, but also there are sector specifics. For instance, in other exporting sectors like industry parts and so on, the main focus is now how do they keep their employees on payroll, given the significant decline in exports. And so for that, the options include direct loans through banks for these industry parks, but also a possible support on payroll to selected exporters. And then when we look broadly at SMEs, the big issue is on the job loss. The Ethiopia Jobs Commission estimates that close to 1 million jobs could be lost if the pandemic continues to sort of hit the economy and then leave an economic impact for the next couple of months. If things don't change, if we continue with more or less full or partial closure, then the cafes, the restaurants, the daily laborers and so on will be affected. So for that, largely the entry point is on how firms can support their employees. The employees are willing to support their employers rather are willing to support their employees by paying their salaries, but they need the cash requirements, support from the government in terms of loans, soft loans, and also some sort of data structuring. So that is what I meant by concerted effort. With the firms play their role, employees play their role, and also the government makes sure this support is properly coordinated. But in Ethiopia, like economy, a big worry is if you do complete lockdown or even the kind of lockdown that we are in, there are people who can't survive for a day or two because their livelihood depends on their daily activities. And for this vulnerable group, the government is working on a broader strategy of how to respond to this vulnerable group by availing even food support if needed. And in that regard, we have identified the potential number of people that might need immediate emergency, either cash support or direct food support, and resources being mobilized internally and externally. And we're mapping out all the distribution channels, including block by block arrangement whereby the government can respond to people's need. Because the most important, people could die of hunger or could die of the disease. So essentially, both have similar effects. So you have to make sure as you work on the epidemiological issues, you don't lose sight of the social and economic costs of the pandemic.
Absolutely, and I think picking up on that the last bit about the social issues, as you say, a lot of people have to sort of go about daily to do what they need to do. How are you? And I know you guys, the country has tried to sort of implement social distancing. How are you going about doing that? What other measures is the government taking to ensure that people are abiding by the laws of staying X meters apart and sort of not going out in public when they need to?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of enforcing this, we are using all political and social institutions. This is a country where people are almost 99% of the people are very much religious. So one important avenue to enforce this social distancing is to use religious leaders. And to that effect, as you probably have gathered, as part of the stay-home decree, all religious institutions have been closed. But in fact, more than that, yesterday, a multi-denominational prayer has been kicked, a months-long prayer has been kicked off yesterday by all religious, Muslim, Christian, Protestant, Pentecostal, all have come together and started a month-long prayer. It's very important, that people sort of search their soul during these difficult times, but also equally, this kind of activities would also encourage people to sort of tune to what the government is saying in terms of the impact that the pandemic could have, and the religious leaders are also conveying this message. So it's very difficult in Ethiopia's context because we have such very closely tied societal arrangements. We human beings are social animals, but in a country like Ethiopia, this takes a completely different magnitude, and it's not really easy to sort of enforce full social distancing, as this would be sort of abnormal to average person, because that is how the social makeup has been shaped over generations. But I think we're getting there. It looks like people are beginning to understand the impact of this. All prominent people, politicians, artists, musicians, Community leaders are now raising the voice of reason, saying the most important and the most effective way is to stay home. And in that regard, that is beginning to sink in, but we have a long way to go.
Understood. And another one of the victims of coronavirus has been the elections, right? Which were scheduled to take place at the end of August. Do you think we could get an indicator to when you think the new confirmed dates will be announced, and sort of what the plans are moving forward on this?
Well, as we speak now, you know that we all don't know how things evolve in the next couple of months or so. So we are all guessing. But as of now, I think the decision is the election board has just suspended its activities and said it will come back to a timeline depending on how things evolve. But as we speak now, it's very clear that an August election is impossible because you can't even organize a small group of meeting, let alone big public rallies that that kind of election requires. So it all depends on how things turn out globally and also the country on. So the decision is suspended with the assumption that as soon as things turn to the best and as we have a sense of how things would evolve, the election board would come up with a different timeline. But it's very impossible to say anything about when and how as of now.
Absolutely. I completely understand there. Last time we met as well, sort of trying to pivot away from coronavirus for a little bit. Last time we sort of met, we discussed the Homegrown economic reform agenda, which you're spearheading. So I wanted to see if we could get a little bit of an update on that, see how the agenda has been developing, and how the implementation of your objectives within it have been going recently.
Sure. If you recall, when we talked about the homegrown economic reform, we said this reform has three pillars: macroeconomic reforms, sectoral reforms, and structural reforms. What we've managed to achieve over the last year or so as part of this reform program is phenomenal. On the macro financial area, we have ensured the macro financial stability. We have begun the process of modernizing the monetary sector. The first market determined treasury bill market has already been set up. We have finalized preparations to launch the capital market. The National Bank of Ethiopia has simplified a number of procedures that were considered problematic for the overall macro financial stability. Credit to the private sector has significantly increased at times 45-50% when you look month to month growth. Overall, our debt, national, domestic and international debt situation has improved, has stabilized, and in fact, if you look at the nominal figure, debt has begun to decline, while we have actually mobilized significant amount of external resources. So, which tells you if we didn't need to mobilize additional resources as part of the homegrown reform, that could have in fact improved more significantly. Another area is resource requirement. We have assumed projected about 10 billion USD for the implementation of the homegrown reform, and that has been fully pledged. On the sectoral sides, on the 5 private sectors that we have identified, significant reforms and meaningful results are underway. Tourism sector, for instance, new tourism. We always have had, amazing tourism potentials, but that we've been hiding from the world. I think this reform has helped us sort of pull out those resources and show to the world that this country has the most amazing diverse set of tourism potential in terms of mining, the focus on the artisan miners, modernizing their operation has kicked through, and also in terms of big mining operations. We have resolved all institutional and procedural challenge that big multinationals have had and significant progress is underway in that regard. If you look at the manufacturing and agriculture sector, I think modernizing our agriculture sector is some important area of focus, and that has already shown significant results in terms of agricultural productivity. But also, if you see the kind of policies the Ministry of Finance has taken to modernize agriculture by allowing duty-free importation of many agricultural equipment and machineries, you see that we are into it seriously. So we are talking. We're not just talking, but we're walking the walk. But also in terms of improving overall structural efficiencies, logistics reforms, doing business, for instance, one big issue we've had is this perception that, especially for domestic businesses, it's very difficult to do business. This required overhauling our overall bureaucratic procedures. More than 40 legal and administrative procedures have been overhauled just as part of this reform, making it significantly easier for people to do business. I can go on, but trust me, we are very, very happy on the overall outcome of the reform program. Had it not been for this, Corona setback, we're actually ready to launch our 10-year, prosperity plan, which shows how Ethiopia would be sort of a breakthrough country, sort of a beacon of prosperity, an African beacon of prosperity, by sustaining its growth, but making it as inclusive and widely beneficial as possible. So that's where we are overall. In terms of privatization, we've continued to push through the privatization process, telecom, sugar, logistics, depending on how the market responds. I mean, preparations have been finalized, but we'll see whether a full-fledged transaction would make sense in the next month or two, or whether it should affect some of the timeline. But that is where we are overall.
Thank you. And picking up a couple of specific points you said there, you mentioned the National Bank of Ethiopia has been sort of leading some, fundamental changes, right? One particular thing that I've noticed over the last week has been the announcement on mobile money. So I was wondering if you could shed a little bit more insight into this for us. In addition to this, you had also mentioned there the telecom sector. My understanding was, or what I've heard is that, the plans for that particular sector may be delayed. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that and whether, yes, that is the case. And if so, what are the dates going to be for that now, or whether that's incorrect? And maybe, as you say, the big financing package that came through from the IDFC is monumental and huge. Perhaps a little bit more insight into where you guys are going to be using that cash. And you mentioned a couple of those sectors. Perhaps you could provide a little bit more detail on some of those projects.
Sure. I think on the first issue, clearly the telecom sector liberalization and privatization is continuing unabated in terms of activities from this side. For instance, if you look at the liberalization process, the most critical issue is based on the feedback that ECA, the regulatory authority, had from a number of operators. They are revising the directives that are essential for the opening up of the sector. And this work is ongoing, and it will be finalized shortly in the next couple of weeks. Then they will continue to go into public consultation on schedule. Of course, people will meet physically, but thanks to technology, there will be virtual meetings whereby consultations can be finalized. Now, what will be challenging is when transaction advances and companies that are interested will need to do physical visits or have meetings with the incumbent and so on. That, as you can imagine, because of the travel restrictions, would be affected. And also overall, the economic shock of the global economy is something that we are all trying to guesstimate. And for now, we're not very sure on how long this lockdown would continue globally and the impact thereof. So those are variables. But from this end, we've not really seen a need to sort of freeze the process. We continue as it goes. But when it comes to critical issues like physical risk and so on, that might build in additional couple of months or so. So we're not venturing into rescheduling the data as of now, but continue the process, and as the process evolves, when chances are that things would turn for the better in the next couple of months, and then as planned this summer, a team can come down to evaluate the transaction. So we'll see. So I think this is the unknown factor. But the mobile money, that is a major breakthrough, another breakthrough that definitely is worth mentioning. As you know, as of last week, only banks were allowed to engage in mobile transactions. But now this new directive by NB would allow non-bank financial institutions, or non-bank institutions, to engage in mobile money transactions. So this would open up a big opportunity for other operators in fintech to sort of engage in financial inclusion. So we see it as a major watershed moment, and hopefully firms that have an interest on this would quickly sort of take opportunity of this new development. In terms of the DFT, as you know, this is a private sector money, or I mean, put it differently, this is a U.S. way of encouraging private sector investment in countries, and this $5 billion is largely a resource that would be available to private sector operators to engage in several sectors, to invest in several sectors in Ethiopia. Definitely sectors like energy, alternative energy. As you know, we have huge potential. This is a country that is 100% green, and the opportunities in many fields in this area are very attractive. Telecom, logistics, and other supply chains, and some critical productive activities, including agriculture, where we hope this money would come in. But again, it all depends on the kind of private sector that sees these opportunities as meaningful. And we know there's significant investor interest in Ethiopia, and this financing would sort of encourage that interest, and I think push it to fruition.
Thank you for that. A couple of final questions. I wanted to wrap three sectors into one question, and sort of get your thoughts on what measures the government is taking to support the healthcare sector at the moment, food security, how you are working with the sort of the agri supply chain to ensure food and produce is getting to the key cities and the key markets and to the people. And I know a big sort of focus for you in particular has been on human capital development. So I just wanted to sort of get a little bit of an update in terms of the education sector. Obviously, with all the social distancing measures that are going to be implemented at the moment, how is the government sort of focusing on education and making sure that educational institutions are able to continue during this time?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think human development is a very important component of our reform program. As you probably have gathered, we give serious attention to our human resource, because that is one of and probably the most essential resource that we have. 100 million people, 100 million plus people, and 70% of these are really young, under 30, which is a big asset. So we see this as a moment where Ethiopia could really benefit from the demographic dividend, because you don't get this every time, as you know. this kind of dividend comes once in a while in a generation. So in that regard, our focus on education, investment in education, and ensuring quality continues. But during difficult time, what the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Higher Education are trying to do is to take the education virtual. Clearly, in a rural setting like Ethiopia, bringing everything online is not as easy as, say, it is in the UK or so. But I think we've been creative. Some satellite solutions are being implemented to sort of access students in the rural areas. The Ministry of Education has started a regular television program whereby kids can sort of follow up courses through different media, including television. And then the higher education institutions, the focus is to sort of encourage them to be engaged, to think innovatively on critical solutions in their area and their community as they take a long break while waiting on how the pandemic turns. So that is an area that is also gaining significant traction, but the most important area of support, I guess, from our development partners is in how we can sort of fully utilize technology solutions in these difficult times. And in that regard, some partners have come forward in quickly availing support for the Ministry of Education in terms of procuring computers, laptops, and some of the satellite solutions I mentioned about.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And in addition to that, food security, is that sort of a key focus that the government is looking at?
Sure. So, it's a question. Yeah, and on food security, as I said, that is the number one priority. During these critical times, you have to make sure that there is no social cost to the pandemic. And the most important area of focus next to health is making sure people have something to eat. That is why I said at the beginning, when we talk about incentive structures or stimulus structure for firms, for businesses, the central focus is how do you keep employees engaged, engaged in a sense, keep them productive when possible, but at least they should be able to be on a payroll for the next couple of months as things evolve. But there are, as you know, the informal economy is significant in economies like Ethiopia, and there are people who are not on payroll. There are people who are making livelihoods through daily activities. So when those activities are no longer available, then the government needs to step in. That is why an overall food support, food security package has been prepared in response to this pandemic. And this has a structure that starts from the Prime Minister all the way down to the warada, the small neighborhoods where people live, with proper food distribution plans. But also, what is quite fascinating in Ethiopia's case is we have a strong social culture, a culture of solidarity. This is a society where people are used to sharing and finding a way to sort of withstand pressures during difficult times, and that has been a display. If you see how the nation is mobilized in supporting one another, that gives you hope on humanity in general. And I think it's a very reassuring development. So that has been mapped out. In fact, the most important priority as we work on the health pandemic, and then something equally important in Ethiopia's context is the food security issue, because whether one person dies of hunger or virus is the same. So you have to make sure there are no casualties in this regard. And we got this. We're really working on this 24/7.
Absolutely, as you say, that the solidarity that's seen right in societies across the world at the moment does instill you with a little bit of hope about the sort of strength and resilience of humanity, which is really nice to see. I'm very conscious, Honourable State Minister, that I've taken up quite a proportion of your precious time. So again, thank you very much for that. Before we finish, I just have one final question, and it's sort of looking towards the future. So I know a core of the GTP2 has been the development of industrial hubs and manufacturing sites. Surely the situation we have seen globally with business and supply chains being disrupted due to the effects of the virus, sort of in Asia, provides an opportunity for Ethiopia to sort of put itself forward as a key sort of destination for investors, who are looking at looking manufacturing their goods, to sort of mitigate against these risks in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, we are conscious of how a lack of careful strategy could leave a permanent shock in economies like Ethiopia. So we're while responding to this pandemic, we're also looking forward. Our plans for prosperous Ethiopia are intact. So in that regard, we're bullish. We're cognizant of the difficult time we're in, but also we're very hopeful that this will come to pass, and it will come to pass. So in that regard, as we work on the emergency, we're also looking at the overall economic response to put the economy back on track immediately as things turn for the best, and how we can sort of sustain successful economic growth we've had, and with all the corrections we've made over the last 2 years in terms of inclusivity, the financing model, and all the elements the reform has in it. So, I mean, in fact, in this connection, I would like to use this opportunity to sort of encourage your listeners to think beyond these difficult times. Take this opportunity to study economies like Ethiopia, how resilient they are, how huge the opportunity is. That is, we've only scratched the surface in areas that we've managed really, but otherwise we've not even scratched the surface as far as the overall economic potential is concerned. So I encourage listeners to think with us into the future and see what is possible in Ethiopia in the next couple of years as we come out of this crisis and continue our journey to prosperity. So yeah, we've set our eyes into the future and working equally on the future plan.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today and to provide that overview. As mentioned earlier, understand that your time is very precious at the moment, so really appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit of an update on the work you guys are doing at the moment. For those people who are looking to keep updated with the work that the Ministry of Finance is doing and sort of the policies you're and the updates you're providing, Facebook, Twitter, what's the best way for them to hear about this?
Absolutely. I mean, we have an active Facebook and Twitter page and the Ministry of Finance page, so I think people can follow us on that. But also the PMO Prime Minister's Office Facebook and Twitter page is also very active. I think these two pages can be of immense use.
Brilliant. Thank you again, Honourable State Minister Dr. Eyob Tolina. And we look forward to seeing you again soon in Addis Ababa and back here in London as well.
I hope we'll see you back very shortly and stay safe out there.
Absolutely. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks again for the time today.